I put in work, a lot of work. Got on my grind to make it work. I put in time to ease my mind. Now all the time I see dollar signs. I got the juice and barbecue. Yeah, I keep making moves, cause I know what to do, I put in work.
Hey, good afternoon. Welcome back to another episode of Network and Chill. And today I am your host, Red, joined with Rick, and we have a phenomenal guest today, Jose Gaztambide. And before we get into his intro, I just want to give a shout out to our sponsors, Amplify Louisville and Amped. I'm excited for the conversation today, gentlemen. Ricky, I'll pass it to you and kind of get us kicked off. And I'm looking forward to a great conversation talking about growth and some impact that Jose is building.
Right. So it's my pleasure to introduce Jose Gaztambide. Jose joined GoodMaps from Interapt, where he served as the COO. Previously, he structured and launched social impact bond and pay for success contracts at Quantified Ventures in Washington, D.C. Jose was formerly a consultant at McKinsey Company, where he served clients in retail, financial services, and private equity, and focused on due diligence, mergers, integrations, and organizational design. Without further ado, I want to introduce Jose Gaztambide.
Okay, guys, thanks so much for having me. I'm doing great, man. How are you guys doing?
Phenomenal.
I'm feeling great. It's a beautiful Friday out there.
Yeah, we're excited. This has been long overdue and been tracking a lot of your work for a while now. I would love to kind of just hear you kind of tell a small background about yourself and kind of like your entry point into tech and kind of what led you to the moment of building and starting GoodMaps.
Yeah, totally. My mom would describe me as a career mess, although I've always maintained that there's a method to my madness. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Honduras and went from the Peace Corps to go and get my MBA at Cornell, and then just kind of wandered into the world of strategy consulting, did a few years at McKinsey, always knowing that I wanted to kind of find the intersection between the private sector and social impact, always just believing that the private sector, if harnessed right, could lead to both economic gain and financial gain and sustainability, but also phenomenal social impact. And so I left McKinsey to kind of start putting that mission and that vision into play in the impact investing space. Through that work, I met my wife, who at the time was with the Domestic Policy Council in the Obama White House. And so after the Obama administration was all wrapped up, she said, you willing to come home with me? And I'm like, what's home? And she goes, it's Louisville, Kentucky. And I'm like, what's a Louisville? Had never in my life, kind of growing up in Puerto Rico, imagined I would lay down roots in Louisville. And, you know, short story long, got connected to Ankur Gopal at Interapt, loved what he was trying to build, thought that it was a really incredible intersection of that social impact and private sector space. And so I joined him and helped him grow Interapt before joining GoodMaps. GoodMaps was another one of those incarnations of the intersection between social impact and private space. And we have a really, really unique story. We were basically a project within the basement of the American Printing House for the Blind. I assume that most listeners aren't familiar with the American Printing House for the Blind. They're a 170-year-old nonprofit that has produced most of the Braille that's ever been consumed in this country. And they had this application that they had built many years prior that was all about helping blind people get around independently. And they had what, to this day, I consider to be just incredible courage and incredible humility in looking at themselves and saying, we're not the natural owner of this technology. And if we want this thing to take off, it can't be grant funded and it can't live in the basement of a nonprofit. It's got to be its own thing, and it's got to harness the power of venture capital and the power of the private sector to have the impact, because trying to make it so that any building that any blind person enters is a place that they can experience is a big mission. It's a big, big mission. And there's no way to do it other than just aggressively and at scale. So they carved out a chunk of their endowment, and they started the company that is now GoodMaps and hired me to run it. And we're coming up on 4 years now of that journey. We're in a very different place than I thought we would be 4 years ago. You know, I think our very first board meeting, my message to the board was, this business plan that you guys have spent all this time carving and creating, frankly, isn't going to work. And so let's start a new one, and one that's focused on two things, or really three things. Number one, the bottleneck to doing what we're trying to do is indoor mapping data. We've mapped the outdoors many times over. We all rely on Google Maps, but your journey ends when you get to whatever building you're trying to get to. And so, all right, I'm at the door of the hospital now. How do I get to the cafeteria? How to get to the particular wing that I'm trying to get to? For most of us, that's not possible. Number two, that we wanted to go focus on was, how do we identify where people are within buildings? Because GPS doesn't work in buildings. And so we went about building a computer vision system that's purely digital, doesn't rely on any kind of infrastructure. It's almost like fingerprinting technology, except using it from an environmental perspective rather than a finger. And we can now get to about 1/4 meter of accuracy on a person or an asset's location with no infrastructure whatsoever. And then the third component is, we have to build something that's universally usable. It's wonderful to enable blind and visually impaired people to get to where they're trying to go, but even people who are deeply passionate about this don't have the budgets to get it done. So let's build something that anybody can use. Let's build something for 100% of the population, not 3%. And that's going to be by far the easiest way to make this available to everybody. Let's embed that impact in all of our products.
Wow. So, I mean, that's an awesome origin story there. And I love the point of this started in the basement, of the American, what was that called again?
The American Printing House.
American Printing House. And it was kind of crazy because I got my actual first computer from the School for the Blind here in Louisville. My very first computer came from
nice.
them. So it's kind of cool to hear that kind of story there, that this kind of started kind of in the basement of the American Printing House there, kind of a similar institute, I guess. I love that they came up with that idea of knowing that this isn't going to survive if it is purely grant funded or comes out of, the nonprofit space. And they had the will and the fortitude to actually separate that out as a company to, meet that need. I think that's something to speak to. I think there's a lot of organizations that could kind of do similar things like that and, push, public benefit. And again, we got these benefit organizations that are starting, and I feel like that's exactly what something like you all are, doing. You're a benefit organization. I don't know if you are registered as a benefit organization, but you are, definitely doing that and meeting those needs. And I just love that idea and how this all came together to start, GoodMaps.
Yeah, thanks for saying that. It's nothing short of amazing. I think in general, people are always asking themselves, what more can we do? What more can we own? How do we grow the list of things we're doing, and therefore the way that we justify our asks for money? And so for an organization like them saying the opposite, how do we support an effort but not inherently kind of own it, is I always struggle to find the right words. It's brave, it's courageous, it's innovative. We have not found an analog for the kind of corporate structure and corporate origin that we have. I think the closest thing you have is the technologies that are built outside of research institutions, and then you find ways to commercialize it. But even that's not the perfect analog in a lot of ways. So yeah, kudos and hats off to the American Printing House. They were as innovative as you could imagine a 107-year-old nonprofit being.
Yeah. I guess as you got GoodMaps started, what were some of those early challenges that you faced kind of building out the development for the technology?
Yeah, great question. I think Andreessen Horowitz had either a book or an article that talked about the common thread of successful startups, and everybody thinks that it's the founder, or it's the quality of the technology, or it's the VCs. I think only the VCs think that. And what they found the common thread was timing and luck. We could not have done what we set out to do even 2 years prior. Because indoor spaces aren't mapped, we had to figure out how to go about these really complex structures and really quickly gather the data about their geometry and then reflect that in a map the way that you and I would kind of expect to experience. And we were asking ourselves that question just as LiDAR was getting so much research and development from the automotive industry that it was getting smaller and the points per inch were getting significantly higher and the technology was condensing, and we were able to put it on a backpack, right? We couldn't have done that even 2 years before. So I think that was a really important component. And then as we were thinking about how do we identify a person or an asset's location without relying on infrastructure, so much was going into computer vision, so much was going into the tools to kind of democratize artificial intelligence, that the timing again there was really perfect. And we couldn't have done that 2 years before we set out to do it. So we got extremely lucky in terms of the timing of when we were asking these questions and when that technology was really available to anybody. And that's what's allowed us to overcome a lot of obstacles that our industry has been facing for 2.5 decades and really kind of say, we did it, we solved it.
I mean, they definitely speak to, LiDAR and the price of LiDAR, like really dropping down kind of early in that, I think 2015-16 range. We were trying to put them on the bottom of drones and we're like, we're not putting, $25,000 in the air, but 3,000, we can do that. So that was a huge flip in the industry when they really dropped that, price of LiDAR down there. And I think exactly what you said, man, it opened up the doors for opportunity when that shift in technology happened. Yeah,
totally. Better to be lucky than good, right?
Yes, like you said, timing. I mean, I think the timing is like you said, the secret sauce. I think there is the timing of when you launch those things. It's product market fit, but the timing of that product market fit is huge key. So moving into kind of that. How does GoodMaps kind of differ from other like mapping and navigation apps, on the market out there?
Yeah, really, really good question. I think there's a few different answers to this, depending on how you think about our competition. So if you think about our competition as other accessible navigation products, so built either for people who are blind or people with mobility impairments, there's a couple of things that stand out about us. Number one, even though we were built from the ground up for people with visual impairment or vision loss, we are a universal navigation tool. And we are intended to be usable by anybody that has a smartphone or really any kind of camera-enabled device. A lot of our competitors are still focused on these very, very, very important but small markets. Number two, we have an approach that is infrastructure free. Most people who are trying to identify location of people or assets are taking Bluetooth beacons, which I assume most of your audience is familiar with. But if not, they're about half the size of a phone, and you kind of glue them or just otherwise get them onto surfaces within your venue, and they emit the Bluetooth signal, and then you're measuring kind of the time of flight of that signal to the asset and using that to estimate location. Bluetooth is not a positioning technology. It's a data transfer technology that we shoehorned into positioning because we had no better options. Candidly, as a positioning technology, it's just kind of a failed technology. There's no appetite for Bluetooth beacons anymore. You've got to change the batteries once every 12 to 18 months. From an accuracy perspective, 5 meters of accuracy, best case scenario. And if there's any kind of interference, you're probably getting closer to like 8 meters of accuracy. They fall off the walls and hit people in the head. I mean, they're just not good tech. And so we're able to say, hey, we walk in with this LiDAR scanner, we scan it, we're there in your building for 2 hours, we walk out, and you never see us again. And there's no upkeep, right? We're doing the upkeep on the back end. So we're able to kind of eliminate one of the really big headaches that people have. I think the third component is that even though the service that we're enabling is navigation, the data that we're utilizing can be utilized for other reasons. So we have fundamentally mapping data we have the positioning technology, and then we combine all of that into an experience that is the navigation service that people experience. But there are other ways that you can use those maps and other ways that you can use that positioning. So we're going to be going live at an airport pretty soon here, and they have a robotics delivery company that wants to consume both our mapping data and our positioning data. Because great, Chris is ordering a hamburger in gate C12. Well, how do I get that hamburger in my little robot from there to where he's trying to go, right? The answer is our tech. And there's all kinds of other ways that you can imagine utilizing that, right, with a little bit of imagination. So that's kind of how we compare relative to other people in the accessible navigation space. On the other side, kind of the more mass market, there are other people who do mapping. They just kind of say, hey, here's a map. You figure out what to do with it. Yeah. There are other people who do some version of visual positioning. And they just kind of say, hey, here's, ingest an image, outcomes, and XYZ coordinate. You figure out what to do with it. We're the only people who are combining that, and we're the only people who are also delivering a service that people are demanding simultaneously. So kind of by necessity, we had to vertically integrate. And as it turns out, we're the only ones who are, and that's a much easier sell.
Yeah, you talk about disruption and innovation to the finest, and really, understanding how you are different from your competitors. I think, hearing that, when you have that kind of innovation and you're looking at customer acquisition, and, what were some of those early conversations that get people to adopt your technology and get in the doors, and kind of how has that changed since inception till today?
You hear our technology, and I think your reaction is, wow, that's really cool, and I don't believe it. And particularly when you're talking about people who have been thinking about accessible navigation and been thinking about positioning in indoor environments, there have been a lot of false promises along the way, and a lot of technologies that said, oh yeah, we can do this. And then you put it to the bare minimum of pressure in a real environment and it stops working. And so a lot of the early conversations for us were, hey, this is really exciting. Now go prove it. Either let's do a really limited pilot for 2 or 3 months, or I'm going to go out and see one of your installations and experience this myself. We even had some really frustrating early days where one of our areas of focus is transit, fixed rail, train stations, that kind of thing. And RFPs would come out from places like Boston and Seattle, and they would specifically ask for Bluetooth-based approaches. And so we would submit our applications, and we would try to talk to the teams and say, hey, here's our approach. And their response was, we had no idea this was possible. Had we known, the RFP would have been different. We've got to go back and rewrite the RFP, right? And you've got to wait a year for them to go through that process. So even just making people aware of what's possible was a really big obstacle. And so education is a really big part of what our sales process looks like. And getting people to go from interested to believing is a really big part.
Yeah, I could definitely see, like you said, with the technology and the price of that technology dropping so rapidly, and then you all coming in when beacons are like out there is everything. That those RFPs and that knowledge and the strategy that they've come up with or got consulting on is kind of like dead in the water before it even got started. Kind of there.
Totally.
Yeah, so that's really cool. You got some, Chris?
Oh, I'm good. I thought you were saying something there. Seeing that piece as well, you were talking about the growth, going from education to understanding. I think during that time period, I've seen a lot of partnerships and collaborations. And so what were some of those initial conversations that create those partners in that collaborative piece? And how has that kind of enhanced your business?
Yeah, great question. So I think we think about those kind of partnerships in waves. I think the first wave was organizations who have an interest in blindness beyond the American Printing House for the Blind. So we had kind of a pre-seed round, and the folks who participated in that were the National Federation of the Blind, who's the largest membership organization for blind and low vision people in this country. We have the Canadian National Institute for the Blind, who is both an investor as well as a distributor in the Canadian market. And then we had Humanware, who is an affiliate of EssilorLuxottica, the big lens manufacturer. And I think their interest was A, because they have products for people who are blind, and B, because so much of what we do impacts this new extended reality, augmented reality world that I think we all know that we're going to be consuming pretty heavily over the next handful of years. So it was both a mission and a strategic investment on their part. And that was really important in terms of getting buy-in from the blindness field and letting people know that we've been vetted by people that you trust and have been around for decades. And even though we're building a broad technology company, blindness is at our core, and we will never lose sight of that. We will never abandon that. It's represented in our mission and our vision and our shareholders. So it's not going anywhere. I think the first big technology partnership that we closed was with Intel. And Intel was looking for a partner to bring accessible navigation to the Olympics, which they sponsor. And they conducted a worldwide search and selected us. And that partnership has really broadened well beyond the Olympics. We're using the Intel DevCloud. We are using OpenVINO. We're using Intel CPUs and GPUs, both on-prem and in the cloud. And they've just been incredible champions for us and opened the doors and helped us figure out how what they can provide from a tech perspective helps solve the issues that we have. And we're immensely grateful. So that was beneficial, A, because their technology was great. And B, because it really helped validate us. It's like, okay, you can play both in this mission-centric, all the nonprofits believe in what you're doing, and the big technology players in the country see value in what you're doing and are willing to put market development dollars in their own technology teams behind it. I think one of the risks that you run into as a social enterprise is, do people take you and your technology seriously?
I know.
Are you a bleeding heart, or are you a bleeding heart with the tech skills to do something at a global level? And having Intel publicly say, hey, we're working with these guys, we believe in what they're doing, really helps us address any of those fears.
Yeah, that's great to hear. I recall reading that Intel press release, and I just thought how, huge that was, like almost that validation piece. And the opportunity to have that on a national scale to really prove out the technology. Because I think we often think social impact can't be profitable, right? And that's oftentimes happens. And I'm like, no, you can actually do good and do good for others, and it's at the same time. And so I love hearing that piece and kind of understanding that. I feel like that kind of puts you in this kind of growth trajectory over the last couple of years, especially over the pandemic. I'm just kind of curious. I know pandemic kind of shifted a lot of lanes in a positive in a way or a negative in a way for many startups and many startup founders. How did you adjust during the pandemic personally, and as the company? What were some of the changes that kind of maybe took place over that time period?
Yeah, gosh, such a good question. And there's a part of me that wonders how much I and we even understand how much the pandemic impacted us and our organizations. I think we're still understanding some of that impact. But I'll say from a personal perspective, I'm a person who gets a lot of their energy from being with their team. I love my team. I love being around my team. I feel like I get the pulse of my team and how people are doing and how excited people are and where does attention need by being in the same room and by just kind of witnessing things. And so I had to adjust to not being in the same room as my team, sometimes for months and months at a time. And that was hard from a few different perspectives, but we adjusted and we survived and we grew. From an organizational perspective, it was, I would say for the first few months, we continued to swim against the current. We had some traction in the healthcare space. We had some traction in the senior care space. And we were really excited about that work and the impact that we could have there. And it took us a while to kind of come to grips with the fact that we just weren't going to get their attention. And that just wasn't going to be possible until this was under control. And so we really pivoted away from it. And we said, hey, guys, we're here and ready to talk whenever the bandwidth opens up. And we started thinking about verticals that we had never seriously thought would have potential for us. And so I remember in the early days, as we were thinking about the 7 or 8 verticals that we could go after, and one of them was retail, and we thought to ourselves, there's an elephant's graveyard of companies that have tried to do what we're doing in retail. Let's not even dedicate a single brain cell to figuring out how we do that. And fast forward a year and a half, and retail accounts for about 50% of our pipeline and our sales. And it was really all incoming. They heard about what we were doing. They reached out. We did pilots. We proved out the tech. And now we're growing that footprint. And so I think that's an example of how we were surprised and how sometimes you just got to be comfortable with the fact that you were wrong and listen to the market and revise the hypothesis when the market tells you it's not right.
You're on mute, Ricky. You're talking on mute, Ricky. Yeah, you're on mute, Ricky.
Yeah,
there you go.
Yeah, I was saying, no, I think that's a good note that you said, like, to pivot, basically. If the market you got to listen to the market. If the market's telling you, you got to, keep your ear to the ground, and the quicker that you can hear those signals, the better. Like you said, fail fast, fail early, I think is definitely a big key there, which kind of, I guess, leads me into the next question of, like, when we're talking about, location data and things of that nature, how does GoodMaps think about, data privacy and security of, its users there from that point cloud perspective of, you have a blueprint of all of these, buildings and all of this area. Like, how do you, I guess, think about that for the future, and how do you kind of protect that?
Yeah, I think there's 2 ways to think about that. In some ways, Ricky, that is the question. And there's 2 ways to think about it. I think the first one is, how do you ensure and protect the privacy of the mapping data itself? One of the reasons that Google and Apple have really not managed to make an impact in this space is that they want to own the mapping data, and they want to put it in front of as many eyeballs as possible, right? That's the business plan. And if you run a high school or a hospital or an office building, you don't want anybody with an internet connection knowing the layout of everything and where everybody is. And so we recognized that early, and we said to ourselves, listen, we can gain a lot of insights from our data, but we're not fundamentally a data company, we're a services company. And so our clients own the data, and they get to make a decision on who gets to see that data. Every map comes with different security levels, which the client gets to control. And so if I've got an office building, I can decide that the atrium is accessible to everybody in the public, but floor 1 is only available to first responders, and floor 2 is only for employees that have been verified. They get to decide who gets to see that data and when they get to see it. I think the second question is about the privacy of the user, right? We're tracking position or providing your position. How do I make sure that that's not getting in the wrong hands and not violating privacy? So when we receive positioning data, it's all anonymized. We have no idea who's associated with it. All we get to see is that one of our positioning results was in this particular map, right? You can imagine kind of a heat map approach. We don't collect any individualized data. Everything that is kind of individualized for the user is happening on device and not collected by the institution. So we'll never be able to say that Chris was, checking out the 40-inch TVs at Best Buy, but we will know that somebody was checking out the TVs at Best Buy. Just no way to associate it back to.
Oh, cool. I think that's definitely. I love the idea that you can change those accesses to various areas of a building. Basically with the switch. I know being on like the board at MSD, we do like these. I see like a double use for like the mapping data for training, for instance, for like first responder activities and things like that. Like instead of actually having to bring in the fire department and the police to actually do a drill, with them, we can now put this in, I'm a plug for the metaverse here. If you put that in the metaverse and using kind of your data and kind of actually, use those kind of like scenarios and things like that. So I think that's awesome that, you can change those parameters in which you can access that data.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Ricky. I am obsessed with the impact of indoor mapping and positioning in the metaverse in the emergency response space. We talked earlier about one of the ways that COVID impacted us. We were working on a product called GoodMaps Response, which was basically a firefighter's view of the mapping data as they were getting ready to show up on site.
Wow.
And in interviewing firefighters, we were blown away by the opportunity. I mean, unless you happen to have walked through that building and you happen to remember that building when you were doing the safety inspection, you don't know what you're walking into. And we were talking to a captain out of Anchorage, and he said, "Man, if we had had this technology, I would have attended fewer funerals in the past." And you're just like, "Oh my God!" Like such an opportunity, not just economically, but in terms of life and death. You know, things that are so subtle that you never think about, like what is the building made out of? It turns out the building materials impact the way that the fire behaves. Well, it'd be great to have that information. Most buildings are divided into zones, right? You can imagine it as a quadrant, zone 1, 2, 3, and 4. So when the fire alarm goes off, you say, "Oh, you know, the fire was tripped in quadrant 1." Well, guess what? You don't know where quadrant 1 is, right? You don't have a map of the space, and you don't know who decided where quadrant 1 was, right? That impacts the way that you think about your strategy when fighting a fire. Where are the flammable materials stored? Where are the systems that, you know, control everything? There is so much possibility to impact and to save lives by bringing this there. Now, I think part of the problem is if you've only got 1% of a city covered, that's not going to be all that valuable. So part of our thinking on the matter is we've got to wait until we're at a point where there is critical mass before that mapping data starts to be relevant enough in a first responder setting.
Yep. No, that makes sense, man. But I definitely see, you know, that being definitely a huge opportunity in the future to, you know, not only for accessibility for folks, but like the next layers of that, saving lives, like that's going to be really important.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I was gonna add to that because you're talking about, you know, the unique insights you didn't realize, especially in retail, that you, as a use case. Has there been any other insights or research or data that you've seen over the last year or so that particularly you were surprised by, in another area that potentially you're in that wasn't a part of your initial roadmap?
Yeah, great question. So I think a couple of things that have surprised me, and both of them go back to retail. For your average retail store, 50% of the labor of the associates that are on the store is spent helping us find the products that we're looking for. And for some of the larger retailers in the country, that can be almost a $2 million expense per store per year, just helping us find stuff. There is such an economic opportunity to just making it easier to get around these stores, whether you're blind or you're like me and just get lost in your kitchen, right? I think relatedly, the way that we think about retail environments and experiences in the retail environments is really changing. I think the mentality used to be pretty similar to casinos, which is if we can get you lost and not have any clocks or windows, you'll spend more time and you'll spend more money. And it actually turns out that when we walk in, you know, you're a single mom, you've got 30 minutes to spend at the grocery store before it's time to go pick up your kid. You're just going to get as much in your shopping cart as you can in that time, and then you're going to walk out at 30 minutes because it's pickup time. And so it's less about, okay, how can we get people to stay as long in our store as possible, and more about how can we make it as intuitive and easy and seamless as possible so that you can get everything you need, right? And ultimately increase your basket size. Yeah. And so I think these navigation tools play a really big role in that.
That's extremely cool because I think is what changing the customer experience to me, and because I don't like spending too much time in the grocery store, right? And so understanding that, knowing that I came here for certain items, I want to check off every item on that list and not walking out disappointed, makes a huge impact. So I think that's a really cool data point.
There's one little vignette that I think really drives that home, if I may, Chris. I'm sorry for interrupting.
Go ahead.
And going back to this idea of like the stay-at-home mom shopper, the two things that mothers traditionally walk into a retail environment to go purchase are food, and particularly vegetables, and then beauty products. And so for a long time, when you looked at store layout, when you walk into the store, what you would see was the fruit and the vegetables, so you could do that. And then on the opposite side of the store, as far away as possible, were all of the beauty products. And the idea is, okay, you're going to buy the stuff that connects the two. Obviously, as we just described, that's not exactly how it works. And so there was a regional grocer who literally did nothing but flip the thing, the beauty products in the corner with the item that was closest to the food. And they increased the average basket size by like 38% just by switching where things were in the store. I mean, there's just so much value, so many insights that come from just changing the way that you think about people's experience in your environment.
Mm.
Oh man, that's definitely insight there. Like we talk about, like I said, with the benefits organizations, like if we're solving problems, we're meeting a passion, like that's where I feel like the rubber meets the road, and you can run with that idea, especially when you find that product market fit there. So what are some of the things that you see as the future for GoodMaps and the growth stages? So like what's the future growth look like of GoodMaps in the next 1 to 2 years, and then 5 to 10?
Yeah, so right now we really have product market fit in 2 verticals, and that's retail, as I've been talking about, and rail, train stations. And for rail, a little bit in the US, but a lot in Europe. So a lot of our growth in 2023 and 2024 are going to come from mapping train stations in the European continent, and really primarily the United Kingdom at first, and really thinking about Northern, Central, and Western Europe as kind of natural expansions from there. So we're really excited about that. Likewise, in retail environments, just helping people get around and opening up these environments in a way that certain portions of the population haven't had access to, I think is really exciting. The third vertical, which we have a healthy amount of excitement and also respect for, is healthcare. Hospitals have been shopping for this kind of technology for decades. It's taken a lot of forms. I think a lot of people have probably seen those like little kiosks when you walk into the hospital. Mm-hmm. The problem with those is, okay, great, you've got your directions, then you take 10 steps and you're like, wait a second, where was I going? You can't take the kiosk with you, right? And they also struggle with a lot of the positioning technology limitations. We're going to be doing some work this calendar year with, well, I probably shouldn't say who, but with some large healthcare organizations. And for us, it's a lot about proving out the hypothesis. Does the technology and the way that we approach that technology work in a healthcare space? How does the delivery of the technology have to differ going into that space? How does it impact operations? These are by far the most complex environments that we map. So how do we think about the amount of time you have to spend in there, the amount of time that it takes to produce a map? And then hopefully by the end of this calendar year, we'll know how we're going to grow that particular vertical. Yeah. From a technology perspective, in the first half of this year, we're going to be releasing the next version of our product, which is very focused on augmented reality or mixed reality or extended reality, however you want to think about that. And we're really, really, really excited about this because from a sighted person's perspective, it is by far the most intuitive way to consume directions. Right? If I just hold up my phone and I see little arrows pointing me on the floor where it is that I'm trying to go, the user acceptance testing that we ran on that stuff showed really high UAT scores, whether you were a 20-year-old, millennial who spends all day on TikTok or a 65-year-old grandma who isn't terribly comfortable with their phone and doesn't like to travel. And so I think being able to deliver that kind of experience to anybody, obviously in particular for us from a value proposition perspective to a sighted audience in addition to a sightless audience, is really, really cool. Is really, really cool, and it's going to unlock a lot of excitement and usage and value.
Yeah. Are there any technologies that you all are kind of looking for in the future that'll help you kind of accelerate, some of those things? I know, like, getting a point cloud down to a phone or running that on a phone is pretty much, almost impossible to some extent. But how are you all looking for any new technologies to help with that, or that you see in the future coming out to make these things easier and more accessible? I know that the partnership with Intel and having that on the back end is probably really helpful, though, having those CPUs, cranking on the back end. But how do you envision, things coming out in the future that'll help you with that?
Yeah, there's a few things that we are on the lookout for. So I think number one, the obvious limitation with our solution as it exists today is it requires a data connection. And it doesn't have to be a super high data connection, but we do require data. And you think about, I mean, could you imagine having something that requires data and you're traveling through the New York City subway? You need something that works in no data, right? Mm-hmm. So bringing the data on device, but more importantly, bringing the mechanics of positioning on device is really high priority for us. And we think there's a roadmap to get there. And I think in particular, because all of those operations are really fundamentally computer vision based artificial intelligence, and so much of the way that these phone manufacturers are thinking about the chips of the future is being able to enable things like that. It's a question of when, not if, we're going to be able to do that. I think another component for us, we're always looking for ways to condense our operations using automation, in particular artificial intelligence. And so you can imagine, right, pick the next kind of large environment that you have, an airport, a retail environment, your office space, and there's going to be just a really high density of items that are in that space that when you look at your map, you want to be able to identify, whether you're just an employee trying to get to an office building, or sorry, a meeting room, or whether you're the maintenance guy who wants to be able to identify, like, where are all the power outlets, where are the supply closets, where are all these things that I need to be aware of. And so one of the things that we're working on is as we go through these environments with our hardware capturing things, how do we create very specific item identification algorithms to pick out the things that people care about in that space without it requiring somebody from my team saying, hey, that thing is here. We just ingest the images, identify the items that are of importance to the people who are going to be ingesting those maps, and then automatically populate them on the maps. The way that I described it is really simple, and actually building that is not. So we're working on that.
No, really cool innovation. I'm really excited about that, and seeing the roadmap, new verticals, and just the disruption into different industries this year. Kind of as we kind of close out and get to our fire round, one thing I didn't want to glance over is like really just seeing the large growth that, you know, from my employee standpoint, that the GoodMaps teams it has really been able to take on this year. And reading a recent press release, and we kind of briefly talked about you hiring a COO, but then realizing that person was Teresa Reno Weber from Metro United Way, formerly CEO over there. And it's reminded me of this conversation of, like, you know, of having talent, right? And being able to approach talent and being able to grow a company here in the Midwest. How have you really, you know, approached, you know, hiring talent, and also approached the change and building a larger team and kind of letting go to grow in a sense?
Yeah. I'll I'm going to take those in the opposite order in which they were asked, because I have been surprised about how hard it has been for me to grow the team from the perspective of letting go of things that in the early days I was really attached to, and what that means in terms of the way that my relationships have to change with my staff, particularly the people who have been with me since day one, how that changes in terms of managing through my direct reports instead of managing directly, how that changes the way that I think about building a really strong senior team. And if the senior team is aligned, and if we all know what our rocks are, and if we all know what the priorities are, then I don't have to be around all day, every day. That's been a transition, and it's been a fun transition, but a hard transition, and one that you know, candidly, I'm still going through. I've got to learn when not to get involved. And I think at a certain stage, you can just create chaos and make life harder for people. So I've been really conscious about that. In terms of what it takes to attract really good talent, you know, I think we find ourselves in a fun little spot where we're working with really cutting edge technology that people want to work with and want to say that they're working with, and is going to open up opportunities for them down the line. We're doing something that improves the world and bridges the gap between the world that we live in and the one that we aspire to build. And we're in a market that's really large that we can go after and kind of treat this as in some ways, as a typical venture-backed opportunity and say, hey, we're all going to grow. And there's a lot to go around. So join us and partake in that. I would say that we have been unapologetically a self-selecting culture. I think that you come and you spend 15 minutes with us, and really quickly you know if we are of your tribe or not. And I think from a culture building perspective, from a talent building perspective, I can't imagine doing it any other way. You either identify the people that you want to carry this rock up a hill with, and you jump into that, or it's not your people and you don't. And I think where you get in trouble is in that middle zone of trying to shoehorn somebody because you really like them, or shoehorn somebody because they've got the right skill set, and that's a project that you've been struggling with. I think that's a really easy way to degrade culture. And I've always been a culture nerd, but it's not until recently that I've really appreciated how much culture is everything. And if you don't have the right culture, if you don't define it, if you don't filter for it on the way in, if you don't reward it while it's here, you're really not going to grow. Your team and your team's ability to understand what's expected of them and to communicate that to people as they enter the organization, it's everything.
What are some of the things
that you
what are some of the things you've done early on to kind of infuse that culture then?
So a few things. Number one, we both kind of at inception and then again in 2022 spent long periods of time refining our values. And I think a lot of people have spent time in organizations where values are things that are on the wall, and then you just kind of roll your eyes at them because they don't impact you.
Yeah.
And we spent time really making sure that our values were easy to define, were easy to identify, and frankly, were aligned with our strategy. Values are the expectations that you have of your coworkers in terms of their behaviors, and they're fundamentally behaviors. And so if those behaviors aren't attached to the way that you think about winning in the market and executing in a way that's going to allow you to win, you're just not going to do a very good job of it. So we spent lots and lots of time on the values and in socializing and sharing those values. We now use those values as part of our intake process when we're interviewing people. And we use those values during our quarterly reviews and just saying, how well are you living this idea of focused on forward? How well are you being data driven? And when do you incorporate that or not incorporate that? How are you doing on being collaborative and inclusive? Right? These are things that you can say, I'm doing it or I'm not doing it. And I think if you've got a value that's really soupy, it's not really a value, right? It's just a pretty word. And so we try to incorporate that structurally as much as we can throughout the organization.
Yeah, I think that's very important, man. Mission, views, vision and values are like the keys to like keeping the company focused. And like you said, when you're trying to be hands off with those folks that you're bringing on, like if everyone has the mission, vision, values in line, then we should all be in the same ballpark at least. Otherwise, like something is really wrong. So I love that.
Totally.
Totally. And as before we jump into our fire round, I want to ask, so what advice do you have for an aspiring entrepreneur or someone just getting started? What would be that one piece of advice that you would want to share with an aspiring entrepreneur just getting started?
I've got two that I'll share. The first one is going to be a little weird, but I'll share it anyways. My favorite book, and maybe the book that has impacted me the most on this journey, is called Letters to a Young Poet. From Rilke, and it's a back and forth series of letters between a poetry professor in Germany in the late 1800s and one of his students trying to figure out how to do it. And there's a quote in there where he tells his student who's really struggling with something that he's trying to write that if you can't sleep until you get this piece of art out into the world, then it's not worth doing. And I think that is really true of people that are trying to build a business too. You've got this idea and it's got to become an obsession because the world's going to throw a lot of bumps on the road and a lot of doubters on the way. And if you don't have just absolute conviction and absolute obsession with turning it into a thing, you're not going to get to the point where it is a thing. There's just going to be too many blocks on the road. So I think that's part number one. I think part number two is be smart about the money that you say yes to and the people that you invite on your journey. I think it's easy if you've never done this before to think that a dollar is a dollar. And the reality is that that dollar is attached to a human. And those humans have decision rights, and they have biases, and they have ways that they think about the world and dealing with you and dealing with your business. And somebody once told me that accepting an investor is like getting married with no ability to divorce. And I think that's really true. Picking your partners on different journeys throughout your life is probably the most important decision any of us make. And so just be smart about your dollars and know that you are doing them a favor by accepting their investment, right? They're looking for ways to get a return. It's not a mono-directional relationship. It's a dual directional relationship, and treat it as such.
Two gems right there. I love both those pieces of advice. I think those are things to live by. And I mean, ironically, you kind of read our first fire round question, Jose, was really your best book recommendation. So I'm already glad you dropped that gem already. So I'm going to skip to the next question and let Ricky kind of bounce back and forth. But you just gave, the audience and us like two great pieces of advice. What has been the best piece of advice that you've been given from someone else?
Great question. Make time for your family. There will the to-do list does not end, and nobody is going to make you stop and spend time with your family but you. That's your responsibility, not anybody else's. So just make that time. There's no going back on any of it. I have a little 3-year-old boy, and I'm so grateful that my wife pushes me to make sure that I'm present. And then my team creates the space for me to be present. And then my board respects that I need to be a father first and foremost. But again, nobody's going to do it but you. It's always easy to say yes to the next thing. You've got to say no. It's time to be a dad. It's time to be a husband.
Oh, I love that, man. And I think that too often we don't talk about that enough as, dads running startups, and like we kind of gloss over that part. Like, okay, I'm working hard. But then we were at an event, a couple of weeks ago, and I heard a bunch of the guys just saying that, like, I missed a lot of time at home. And like that really hit, home for, me. I have 2 boys. Chris has 2 boys. And I feel like that's one of the things. That's why I became an entrepreneur, so that I could, have more freedoms to, do those things. So I always want to keep my mission and my vision, in mind as I'm, running my startup, because it's all about them until, at least until they're 18, I hope, but it'll probably be longer than that. But you know what I mean?
Totally.
So our next question in our fire round: if you had unlimited money, what would be your ideal getaway or vacation?
Gosh, let's see here. I love lake houses. I would just go. We have some friends who are touring New Zealand right now, and they sent us some pictures of New Zealand. So my wife and I are obsessed with New Zealand. I think New Zealand would be our getaway. Just getting a nice little flat in Hobbit Town or something like that, right? I mean, that'd be perfect.
Yeah, man.
Yeah, I live for vacation in a body of water, so I'm looking forward to getting away soon. New Zealand would be a great place to go. I haven't been, so I'm going to add that to the list as well. All right, next one's a pretty fun one that Rick and I always love. What 2 people will you pair together to birth the ultimate entrepreneur?
Ooh. Oh, man, that is a great question. Do they have to be like famous figures, or can it be just anybody?
Anybody.
My dad and okay, so let me talk about why my dad. My dad is the most intellectually curious person I know. He just needs to understand things and how they work and why. He just loves unpacking that question. Now, he's an academic, so he would not do well in the entrepreneurial world. So I'm trying to think who just has that scrappiness and that grittiness and that, like, okay, I'm going to be curious, but I'm also just going to move right, and make decisions and move forward. And I'm struggling to figure out with who that second person would be. I'm trying to find somebody like famous who would do that.
Yeah, you have Elon, you have Bezos.
Silence is great on podcasts, right? This is the
No, I'm gonna say you have Elon, you have Bezos. Is it an athlete? I know you're a sports guy, so that's all I'm always thinking about. Though, like these uncharacteristic ones that we always never think about and pairing together.
Marcus Smart.
Oh,
Marcus Smart. Marcus Smart. He got that dog in him.
Yeah.
I love watching him play, and he's not scared of anything or anybody, and he just goes and he'll twist his ankle and dunk in your face, and he's just he's got that dog in him. So combine Marcus Smart's, I'll do whatever I want with my dad's curiosity, and I think you got a beautiful entrepreneur.
Yeah,
that's cool.
Love it. All right, for our last one, what is the secret sauce to making unicorns?
Build a great team, find a product or a problem that people really struggle with, and just be decent to your people and to your clients. Like, I think if you do those three things, it's hard to imagine what'll get in your way.
Yeah. Customer first. I love that.
There you have it, Jose. I mean, it's been a pleasure for you to join us today and really drop some knowledge and let us know more about the company that you're building. Wishing you much success in 2023, personally and professionally, and excited to kind of see the growth and scale of your company this year.
Yeah, man. Keep making moves.
Thank you, guys. This is a lot of fun. Appreciate you.
All right. Take care. All right. Peace, everyone. I enjoy having kind of
more diverse and then becoming
grateful to be kind of at the cusp.
And I had like this 65-year-old.
Make it work. I put in time.